One of the purposes of this course is to draw attention to non-Western traditions of philosophy. So it might seem a little ironic that we're going to devote this and the next couple of lectures to Western thought. I think it's important to do that, though, if only in order to have a basis for comparing different traditions. The reason to start with Western thought is that a lot of times Western thought is in our way of thinking whether we know it or not. But I think it's important to have some of the assumptions of Western thought on the table before we start talking about differences among traditions. This lecture is going to concentrate on early metaphysics and epistemology in Greek thought. Now, what does that mean? Metaphysics simply means what's beyond the physical world as we see it. And epistemology means theory of knowledge. The big question that the early Greeks raised is really a kind of question that we all encounter, but I think most of us simply take the answer for granted. And that question is this: why do people make mistakes? Obviously, people do make mistakes. We do it all the time, in fact. And we tend to think that it's just human to error. But why is that so? And is there a way around it? The early Greek thinkers tended to think that the problem really had to do with the fact that things change. We get accustomed to one sort of thing, we take that to be the way it is, but something changes. They also noticed, of course, paying attention to the fact that people die, that people get sick, that other creatures and plants, for that matter, also sometimes get sick and eventually die, that we can't really take for granted that things stay in as good a condition as they seem to start out. So they tended to think that our real problem is dealing with change, and perhaps the way of getting around error is to somehow get over the fact that we pay attention to change and look at what stays the same. At least in that case, if we can look for something that's permanent and find it, we're not going to be misled by these sort of things that change in appearance all the time. So what the early Greek philosophers did was try to come up with some candidates for what this basic enduring thing would be. These early thinkers are often called the pre-Socratics. Obviously, they did not call themselves the pre-Socratics. The pre-Socratics basically is a term meaning they lived before Socrates, and they didn't know Socrates was coming along. In fact, some of their interests differ quite a bit from Socrates, but they are part of the background for telling the story of Socrates and Plato, as we'll see. In looking for a basic substance, the first candidate for an answer was water. This was the proposal put forward by Thales. Now, Thales is considered maybe the first Greek philosopher, at least he's often called that. And he's sometimes lampooned a little bit. One of the ways that he's lampooned is that he fell into a ditch because he was looking at the stars. He kind of managed to show up his fellows who were making fun of him, though, because one of the reasons he was looking at the stars is he was trying to get some sense of how the seasons were going. And he, in fact, managed to make quite a bit of money by buying up olive presses, since he had concluded that there was going to be a bumper crop of olives that year, and in fact he was right. So maybe it's a little bit more practical to be a philosopher than his contemporaries thought. At any rate, why did he come to the conclusion that water was the basic substance underlying all change? Well, I think it's not in a way so surprising. If you think about the manifestations of different states of a substance, we get a chance to see water in quite a few different forms. We heat water. We notice that there's less of it than there was before. And sometimes we can see steam or feel steam, but we notice that what seems to be happening is that the water turns into a gas. Similarly, if we cool water enough, we have ice. It's frozen. It seems that water, of the sort of things that you find in the everyday world, undergoes more radical changes than just about anything else. And Thales wasn't wrong in one sense. After all, we still believe that water is probably the largest component of our own makeup. So his candidate, water, really wasn't such a bad idea. It's just that I think we now wouldn't take that very seriously as an answer. Other thinkers proposed alternatives. Anaximenes suggested that maybe the really fundamental thing was air. Instead of starting with water, which we might today say is sort of in the middle stage of liquid between gas and solids, why not start with air and talk about it contracting? air changes into other things by expanding and contracting in various ways. So if we see something solid in front of us, an Examines would say, well, we simply have very much contracted air. But it can change, it can expand into other things. Another thinker wasn't very happy with the kind of concrete character of these particular proposals. So he suggested that there was something really more abstract that was underlying everything else. And the word that he used for this stuff is called apeiron, which basically translates the indefinite. Now that really probably sounds incredibly abstract, but let's think about our word matter. What could be more concrete than matter? Well, in a way, nothing, but it's really hard to say what we mean by matter when we start thinking about it. And in a way, the notion of the indefinite that Anaximander proposed is somewhat similar to matter. It's basically the stuff that underlies all change. It's what continues underlying these changes. And Anaximander thought that just having a sense that we do have something that we can't say much more about than that is a good idea. Still other proposals came forward. One that's fairly familiar to us from our own science is the idea that what's underlying change are really tiny particles. Basically, everything we see in the world is made up of tiny particles, which somehow have interactions. The philosopher Democritus was one of the proponents of this view, and his idea was that the tiny particles sometimes swerved into each other, and this created certain changes. All of these proposals might strike us as fairly naive, but if we think about the basic terms in which our own chemistry and physics are discussed, we see a lot of the same ideas occurring maybe in somewhat more sophisticated form, but basically rooted in these ancient ideas. For example, even though we might not talk in terms of water and air, we still do talk about solids, liquids, and gases. Or similarly, we talk about matter as if we had a very clear idea of what that meant. Yet another proposal was put forward by the philosopher Pythagoras, and this is one that again has had a lot of impact on our chemistry and physics. Pythagoras made a great discovery one day just walking along and suddenly hearing something that seemed harmonious. What he noticed was that it was possible to have a very pleasant sounding harmony from people that were hammering metal. And he wanted to get to the root of this and figure out why it was that in some cases you get harmony and in other cases you just view this as noise. He conducted a lot of experiments, and one of his most noteworthy discoveries was that if you take strings that are in simple ratios of length to each other, you get a harmonious sound. This was not his only experiment, but this was one of the bases for his claim that number was what remained the same despite all apparent changes. Even though you had different lengths of string, you could still get a certain kind of consonance if you had the same ratio. And he started noticing number as being something that seemed to recur over and over again, even though the specific occasions exhibiting it varied. This obviously is one of the most important ideas that we carry forward in our science, since after all, there are certain kinds of numbers that are absolutely constant no matter what the situation. And many scientific theories have been constructed on the basis of having these numbers in place, knowing what they are. A debate that I mentioned in the last lecture was also important in talking about the nature of change and whether or not we could overcome the errors that it made us prone to. I talked about Parmenides and Heraclitus disagreeing on whether change was something we should try to get over or not. Heraclitus thought, well, there's one thing we can say remains the same, and that is change. We should take change as what's stable and try to theorize around that. Parmenides, on the other hand, didn't think that was right at all and thought that we should really try to focus on what was absolutely unchanging. Although both of these theories continued to go forward in Western thought, Parmenides' view, I think, has been the dominant one, namely the idea that the normal state for things is to be unmoving, and you have to somehow explain why change happens. That when we've got an explanation, we feel secure in it because things have come to a stop in a way, as opposed to the idea that things are going forward. And things need not have been organized this way. We'll see that in Chinese thought, the assumption is very much the opposite, that the normal state of affairs is for things to change. And if anything, what we need to explain is apparent a lack of motion. But at any rate, in Western thought, the idea of the unchanging got a tremendous boost by the philosopher Plato. Plato, as I mentioned before, was Socrates' successor, his student. And Plato did a lot to further the basic PR of Socrates by writing dialogues in which Socrates is the main character. In one of these dialogues, Socrates is discussing with a lot of people what would make for a good government. And in the course of this discussion, Plato suggests a kind of image of the nature of reality that has been tremendously influential. This particular story is called The Myth of the Cave, and I'll read a part of it to suggest what it is and what kind of conclusions he draws from it. This is Socrates talking to some of the people that he's been discussing government with, and he proposes a kind of thought experiment. Imagine men to be living in an underground cave-like dwelling place, which has a way up to the light along its whole width, but the entrance is a long way up. The men have been there from childhood with their neck and legs in fetters, so that they remain in the same place and can only see ahead of them, as their bonds prevent them from turning their heads. Light is provided by a fire burning some way above and behind them. Between the fire and the prisoners, some way behind them and on a higher ground, there is a path across the cave, and along this a low wall has been built, like the screen at a puppet show, in front of the performers who show their puppets above it. See then also men carrying along that wall, so that they overtop it, all kinds of artifacts, statues of men, reproductions of other animals in stone or wood, fashioned in all sorts of ways, and, as is likely, some of the carriers are talking while others are silent. Now this is the beginning of the story that Socrates tells, but already we see certain things that lend this to be a kind of myth about error. Pretty likely the people who are only looking at what's projected on this screen are not too aware of what might be causing the projection. That's really the whole point. Basically, all the people in this cave are able to see are shadows, and shadows cast by certain kinds of artifacts going by behind them. So they never see the artifacts, they never see the fire that's casting the shadows. And what Socrates suggests is the whole reality that these people deal with is simply a shadow world. Then he proposes that we can suppose someone from this state of affairs somehow gets free. He doesn't tell us how, but we suppose someone no longer is in fetters and actually is able to turn around. This person sees the fact that there is a way out of the cave, so goes out of the cave into the sunlight. And the first thing that happens, not surprisingly if you think about it, is that the person is really disoriented. Think about those times when you're in a really dark room and suddenly you step into sunlight. Sometimes this happens maybe when you're leaving work at the end of the day, or similarly, suppose you've been sleeping and you had the shades nicely drawn and you step into a brightly lit room. It affects your eyesight. And Plato suggests with this story that initially seeing beyond what you're accustomed to just seems very confusing. But gradually this person manages to take the time to go through this eyesight problem, and what he discovers is a whole world out there. The cave is not the world at all. Even these people going by with artifacts is only a little part of reality. But the external world is beautiful. It has all kinds of things. And this seems so marvelous to the person that his first reaction is to want to go back down and tell everybody else about it. Unfortunately, this isn't as easily said as done. The initial response that everyone has is, this man has destroyed his eyesight. Why? Well, because he has the same problem he did before, but in reverse. Coming into the cave from a very brightly lit place, initially he can't see much of anything. his contemporaries notice that he's no longer any good at seeing the shadows on the wall. He doesn't seem to be seeing much of anything at all. And Plato goes so far as to suggest that these people will become really angry if the man persists in pointing out this external world, to the point that they'll want to kill him. Now, this may seem like an extreme reaction, except if one remembers that Socrates was Plato's teacher, and that Socrates had actually been condemned to die by his society. Maybe it isn't such a far-fetched story after all. But how does Plato intend for us to interpret this story? Well, one of the things that the story is designed to put into relief for us is the idea that most of what we understand are really more like shadows than realities. Plato's view is that the everyday world that we see gives us a kind of impression of things, but it's not the true story. All the things we see in the world around us are, in effect, shadows of something more pure and more real in another realm entirely. And this is the realm that we call the realm of the forms. The forms are eternal prototypes of different kinds of things. So if you say there's a form for trees, or forms for a particular tree, a kind of tree, like an oak tree, thinking about that form is what will enable us to recognize that different particular trees all fall into that category. Now, if you think about different particular oak trees, they're not all in the same condition. Some of them have been in sunlight all their life. Some have been deprived of sunlight. Some are in soil that nourishes them well. Some have had to struggle more. They don't all look exactly alike, but nevertheless we notice that there's a resemblance that they have. Plato's explanation is they're all shaped by participating in the forms. What he means by this is that the form somehow is the pattern that's manifest in these various things in the world around us. And things manifest them more or less perfectly. Nothing manifests a form entirely perfectly on this plane. Just as we would say that a shadow might be very sharp and crisp, but it doesn't give us the whole story of what it's a shadow of. Similarly, the things that we see in this world, at least from the standpoint of what appears before us, is never really the whole story. But nevertheless, it can give us a certain kind of inkling as to what reality is. Significantly, these forms are unchanging. They're eternal prototypes, not something that gets revised. There's no improvement on any of the forms, perhaps only improvement on things in the here and now. How do we know these forms? Plato would say that we know them by means of reason. But when he talks of reason, he doesn't expect reason to be something that is really very, very serious and very, very unemotional. I think in Western society these days, we tend to think about reason as something very, very detached. And that's very false from the standpoint of Plato. Plato thinks that reason is our mind in its kind of full sense. So he considers the form of beauty as the most obvious kind of form. He imagines a situation where we notice someone that's beautiful and we just want to be around that person. When we fall in love, this is exactly what happens, he claims. And what he's really saying is that our reason is giving us insight into beauty. And I think a lot of people would not look at most people who fall in love and say, well, no, there's a rational man, there's a rational woman. I think our vision is more that this is someone who maybe has thrown reason to the winds. But that's not Plato's idea. His understanding is that reason is a fully passionate kind of thing. That reason is our way of getting access to the best insight. And this is so overwhelming to us that it's always a state that's profoundly emotional. Plato's explanation of the falling in love case is that indeed sometimes when people are in love, they aren't as rational as would be nice because they mistake things. They mistake the beauty of someone's body for what they're really experiencing. And Plato would say, if you start to notice, perhaps because you're unlucky in love the first time, that you can love many, many people who look rather different, but there still seems to be something in common in the experience, what you start to recognize is that there's this form of beauty that all of these people participate in, though in different ways. And starting to recognize that, reason is lifting us up from just the habits of everyday experience or the habit of noticing beauty in one person to recognizing something that's far more universal and permanent. I mean, even if you are thinking about the beauty of one person, they change in subtle ways from day to day. Some days they're feeling good, they're well rested. Other days they might not have gotten enough sleep, they might be sick. You can't really say that they look exactly the same, but nevertheless, their beauty is something that resonates through them. And that, Plato says, is really what happens with regard to all kinds of categories that we use in everyday life. And the more we recognize this, the more love, in a way, we feel for the forms that we see through our everyday experience. Now, the fact that beauty is considered by Plato to be the most obvious of the forms also points out something rather interesting about his notion, which is that the everyday world in which we live, in which we have a body that gives us certain points of view on things, that world is deficient in certain ways. It doesn't give us the whole story. It might be the means by which we come to an idea, but it doesn't give us the whole idea itself. And in general, he tends to see our bodies as kind of a hindrance to this whole process. Why? Well, for one thing, our bodies are always in one place and one time at a time. We don't see everything. We don't see things from all kinds of perspectives. And we aren't usually in a position to consider all kinds of different things of a certain sort and recognize the form. Instead, we have a very partial view of things. So Plato thinks that what we need to do is use our minds to transcend the limitations of our physical state. That's one of the themes from Plato that we see recurrently in Western thought, though again, not absolutely universally. Some philosophers think otherwise. But on the whole, the body is viewed as kind of a challenge and something that isn't always working together with the mind. We'll talk more about that in the next lecture. Another suggestion that becomes fairly common in Western thought is that the genuine philosopher is rare, that we can't really count on everybody to look for the forms directly. Now, in a way, this is kind of ironic because at the same time, Plato thinks all of us are in a position to recognize reality, to recognize the reality of the forms, such as beauty. But the problem is that we're sort of in a position only to recognize them in a partial way. And this is, again, because we've become incarnate. We're fallen from a previous state. And Plato goes so far as to suggest that in a way we're a reincarnation of a soul that existed elsewhere and was able to look on the forms directly. And that condition, that ability to just simply see these beautiful, wondrous forms in a way that's completely unobstructed, is the goal that we're really searching for. So our human vocation, what our souls really want, is to regain that picture. The picture, in fact, is a wonderful picture because not only does it give us insight into true reality, which is much more beautiful and appealing and complete than anything else that we have, but also there's a harmony among the various forms. There's something like a super form, the good, which puts everything into perspective. Someone that truly has insight into the good is going to be able to recognize what's good in every situation, is going to be able to recognize the harmony of various things in the world and how things all fit together. And the person that Plato considers to be the philosopher is not necessarily someone who completely knows the big picture, but someone who is really, really concerned at finding it, totally motivated by this quest to put everything into perspective. He thinks this, in fact, would be a very good political move to select people like that to rule countries, precisely because he thinks what usually goes wrong is somebody has their own ideas about things, what they want to see happen, and disregards the points of view of other people. If someone were really concerned about the good, what reality is independent of particular interests or particular ways of looking at things, that person would be in a good position to figure out what really would work, what really would help to support a life for everyone. So some of the basic themes in this notion that Plato has that we see again and again are the body interferes with insight into reality, that what endures is more real than what changes, that there are actually two realms, the realm of these true forms and the lesser realm that somewhat resembles the true forms, but isn't exactly perfect and tends to mislead us. But finally, despite what seems to be a bit of a problem there, that we're all naturally drawn to insight, and that when we gain insight, or the more we gain insight, the more we recognize that the world is fundamentally harmonious, that all these different things in the world do work together. Now, some of these themes we pick up again in the next important philosopher in Greek thought, Aristotle, the student of Plato. Aristotle was, in a sense, the perfect student because he would argue with everything that Plato had to say. He is a perfect student if you're a philosopher, that is. And philosophy in Greece was practiced very much as a kind of debate. Aristotle agreed ultimately with some of Plato's ideas. He thought certainly that the most fundamental truths were unchanging, that change was really the problem, but something that our reason can help us to see through. Where he differs from Plato primarily is that he doesn't agree that these things that are unchanging exist in another realm. Instead, what he thinks we ought to do is just look at the things around us. Plato's view is the things around us kind of mislead us in various ways. So what we really need to do is use our minds to penetrate what appears. But Aristotle thinks what we need to do is inspect and examine things very, very carefully. It's maybe no surprise, given this interest, that Aristotle was a fantastic biologist. And he was fascinated with classifying different kinds of things. I mean, he was very well aware that oak trees look different depending on what their circumstances are. But what fascinated him was, what is the basic structure? What do they all have in common? How do we know that this is an oak tree and not another kind of tree? This kind of classification fascinated him, but it has more than a kind of taxonomical interest. It's interesting because Aristotle thought this is exactly the way we come to know what the universal principles are. We examine lots of different cases and come to recognize what he saw as the essence of a kind of thing, its essential structure. If you think about a biology book or an anatomy book, it shows you something like the basic structure of the human skeleton, or the basic structure of the circulatory system, or the basic structure of a mollusk of a certain sort. There's something in the picture, in the diagram, that shows us the basic things that need to be there to call it this kind of thing and to understand it as this kind of thing. Of course, none of these pictures looks like anybody precisely. I mean, that seems to be almost required for the kind of diagrams of the human skeletal system. You don't get the impression, gee, that reminds me of my cousin. Instead, this is something to be completely generic. But Aristotle would say the generic features of this are exactly what we need to look at when we're trying to figure out what doesn't change. Dogs appear in all kinds of sizes and shapes, but what makes them dogs is the fact that they all have the same basic structure. So what Aristotle thinks we ought to do is use our reason to see what doesn't change, but very much from the point of view of what's in the here and now in our everyday world. So he agrees with Plato that some things don't change and that these are what we need to use our reason to find out about. But his way of explaining what they are and where they are, in a sense, is very different. What they are, he would say, are not forms of a transcendent sort that we have to sort of lift our souls up to see. Instead, we really need to kind of look at the here and now, look at things around us and see what pattern recurs over and over again. Now, both Plato and Aristotle would say reason is the key to figure out what these unchanging things are. Aristotle, in particular, reflects on contemplation. His claim is that contemplation is the best life for human beings. And why is that? Because when we contemplate, we come to recognize these things that are unchanging, that are really true, that are going to give us reality. So what both Plato and Aristotle do, and bequeath to Western philosophy generally, is to point out the difference between the world as it appears and a more fundamental reality.